Welcome to another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? This is a space where writers and other creators come together to talk about their journey and their books and just have a good time. And I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Karen E. Osborne, author of Getting It Right, Tangled Lies, Reckonings, and the upcoming historical fiction based on real people novel True Grace, which comes out in September. And today, my guest wrote a memoir, and I so enjoy. See, I read it. I so enjoyed reading this book. So I'd like to introduce you to Robert Johnson. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Karen, how are you today?
I am awesome, and I am so glad you're here. I'm so thrilled to introduce you to our audience and to talk about this really, really fascinating book. Here's what one reviewer said about Rob's book. He said, "A first-hand account of justice and commitment, a splendid look at what commitment, respect, honor, service, and candor can result in. Inspiring and satisfying."
Well,
Whoa.
that's quite impressive. I like
Don't you
that.
think? Right? Don't you want to read that
Yes,
book?
I sure do. Thank you for having me, by the way.
Oh, I'm thrilled to have you. So this is a New York story, you said, right in
Yes, it is.
your title. This is your New York story. So why did you decide? What made you think? I mean, it's a daunting thing to write a whole book and to bare your soul. Why did you decide to do this?
It was a difficult task in bearing my soul, in reflecting and opening up all of those chambers I've locked away for many years. But first and foremost, the reason I did this book was for my descendants, so that my grandkids, and I have one grandson now, and three children that are all adults now. But my concern was at this stage of my life, in the semi-retired phase, that I don't know half enough, if anything, about my grandfathers and my great grandfathers. And it occurred to me, I've spent some time doing research on them and finding out what I could, but it's never satisfying, and unfortunately, many families, when people die, they die, and the stories aren't passed down, and kids are left to wonder who their grandfathers were or great grandfathers were. I know names, but I don't know anything about them personally. So it occurred to me that number one, why leave my kids in the dark like that about who I am, number one, and then who my father was and who my grandfathers were. And I touch on my father and my grandparents in this book to give insight. So therefore, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road behind me will know who I was and who my father and my grandparents were.
So what's in it for the non-family? Is there something that, like, I'm not one of your kids.
Secondly, so that was the first reason
Okay.
I wrote the book. But the second reason was I had a lot to get off my chest. And I have, a lifetime of, interesting and troubling stories, that I figured the average reader, whether someone who reads memoirs or novels, might find interesting. I've had quite a life. And when I reflect on it, I thought to myself, this should be in a book. Why not share my story with the world? And
Yes.
here I am today, a published author of a memoir. So I'm proud of it.
I'm so glad you decided not to just do this for your family.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's such an interesting point you make. Great True Grace, which is coming out in September, if I haven't mentioned that already, this is based loosely on my grandmother's life. And there was so many, I couldn't make it a nonfiction book because there were so many missing pieces. So you're exactly right. It's a wonderful thing. So when I want to go back to the bearing the soul part. I remember writing my first novel, which was had the most autobiographical, as many novelists, their first novels also, have lots of things based on their own lives. And I remember just crying through the whole darn thing while I was writing. And you write about some really tense times as a child. Um, and you know, how hard was that? How To what degree did that did you find that hard to do?
You know, it was difficult, but I can honestly tell you that all the violence and hatred that I experienced as a young person um, was more difficult back then. In recounting it now, it wasn't as difficult
Mm,
because I've aged and I've learned to cope and process things, and so the actual traumas that I suffered, being a victim of multiple assaults as a child, as a kid, um, was much more difficult back then. What was difficult in the process of writing about them today was reflecting on how my deceased parents aided me when they could. And then
yes.
having to write about them and their response to seeing their son in this state, and then having to be sad that they're no longer with me. And so it brought back a lot of emotions, and there were some tears in the relation to my parents when going through said traumas. So that was the more difficult part, and all of the personal stuff with moms and dads and grandparents, and the loss of loved ones over the course of a lifetime, and bearing it out in this fashion publicly was second to the actual, as far as the emotion in writing it down, and like, oh my God, I can't believe I just wrote that. And then reflecting, wow, that really happened, and there were times in my little office here where my work was done. I have pictures of my mom and dad, and family around on the walls. So my home is kind of like a museum, 2 or 3 generations worth of photos. So it was quite eerie. It was quite sad at times, and it was quite comforting as well, because I felt like they were with me in the
Yeah.
pictures, looking down on me. And yeah, so that was the
Okay.
toughest part. Not the act. Going through it was obviously tough as a kid, and fearing, and being a frightened kid, trying to fit in and not fitting in anywhere. Right now, it troubles me now.
Well, hold on. So talk to me a little bit about that not fitting in part, because one of the things that really struck me in reading your memoir was that you faced racism and being beat up in schools from white kids and black kids.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, and that really struck me.
and honestly, that was a big, because of society today, and not just today, my whole life. Um, I thought that this was a interesting twist, because we often get accounts of racial hatred and violence, one color against the other, one race, one ethnicity against the other. But I kind of, uh, the what troubles me most is today is that I'm still dealing with race, uh,
Mm,
and having, I feel like I fit in everywhere and I don't fit in anywhere at the same time. Sometimes it's a weird dichotomy, and in that because of my years of life and experience, and the wisdom I have today, um, I can wear different faces for different crowds, and
mm,
and be one with everybody in each group now, because I know how to deal with people now, and I'm comfortable in my own skin. However, it still troubles me that I have to do that. I have to change personalities to fit different ethnic groups. You know,
Code switching.
exactly. However, as a child, it was much more difficult in that you know, back, you know, in my earlier days, the violence I experienced at the first part of my life was basically mainly from white kids, you know, and it was kind of expected. You know, me and my brown skinned brother uh, were, you know, growing up in the 60s and 70s, you kind of expected there to be racist whites out there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, you know, the hate was, it was mean, it was nasty, and but it was it, the fights were mainly fist fights, skin to skin and
Mm.
one on one, and there were a lot of busted lips and bloody noses and some black eyes, you know.
Mm.
But you know, so it was, but the hate was real, and it was very painful in that, you know, at, you know, 10 and 11 and 12 years old, you
Mm.
know, finding out that you know, because you only come. I was fortunate; there was a lot of love in my house. But when you go out, you know, from start kindergarten on, you know, you're introduced to this world, and then, you know, if you have parents like I did, my father was a news guy, so I learned a lot at a young age about the hate that was in the world, and then I went out there, and it was like, wow, they really hate me because of, you know, what we look like.
Because of your color, just because of,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
And then
then,
what happened when you moved? So you moved into a more
yes,
Black, you know, lots
exactly.
more Black people.
Right. So it turns out we grew up, the first 12 years of my life, we were in a housing project on the west side of Queens, close to Manhattan. We had Manhattan skyline in our view from our window, and off the rooftops. Um, that was it was a diverse project. There were white kids, Black kids, Latino kids, Indian kids, Asian kids. And in
Mhm.
my courtyard in particular, we were a melting pot. And it was kind of like our gang. We all got along in that courtyard. But my
Mhm.
brother and I, we were with a group that went to the Catholic school. You know, my father was a police officer, and they decided to put us in Catholic school. And it was, you know, 99.9% white Catholic school.
Ah.
And in going to that Catholic school, we had to go past a garden apartment complex that was full of the residents there were all Irish American, German American, and Italian American, I would say. And, you know, they were not all, but there was a faction of them and their children that were just, you know, staunch racists, you know, for, you know, and for no reason, it seemed like at times. But so anyway, we my father and mom were able to get the money together to buy a house, and my older sisters were prompt pushing, and we should move out of here, we should move. And we got a dog, and then they didn't want dogs, and so they finally said, you know what, let's do it. And they found a house on the other side in southeast, on the other side of Queens, southeast Queens. And they bought a house in an all Black neighborhood, you know. Now my brother's about a shade or two darker than me, depending on what time of year it is, you know.
Yes.
So when we moved to that side of the town, you know, my brother was, you know, he fit in perfectly. And then I was, you know, the lone white guy on the block and in the neighborhood and in the school and on the bus. And it was a visceral hatred of me because of my light
Just because of
skin.
your light skin and your light eyes.
Exactly, my greenish blue eyes. And I mean, I almost lost an eye. I tried to cut my eye out in an assault
Mm.
that I suffered. But there was, and then the violence, you know, was in that was often multiple people. I was being jumped on different occasions, you know, and you know, by older kids, you know, bludgeoned with weapons and things like that
Mm.
from middle school through high school. And don't get me wrong, I found a good circle of friends, and I you know, somewhat hard knocks, school of hard knocks. I learned to fit in, and I had by the time I was in you know, midway through high school, I was one of the tough guys, you know, and I had respect around the neighborhood.
So
However,
did that help you be a police officer and a detective? Do you feel like that experience, besides your father being a great role model for you, and the cops that he hung, that he hung with and you knew, but you think that really helped you as an adult?
I truly believe I had a calling to be a police officer. And don't get me wrong, I didn't know it in high school or
Yeah,
middle
yeah.
school or in grammar school. However, as I got older and um, I knew there was one thing about me by between junior year of high school and through college, I despised bullies, you know.
Mm,
I often found myself in the neighborhood while still in high school defending younger kids against bullies, you know,
mm.
and I became somewhat of a protector to the younger kids on the block in Queens, not and in school. Or I also found myself in settings in high school, you know, when I made varsity football, um, defending the new kids against hazing. I just took this role. You know, I have vivid memories of instances where I saw kids being mistreated, and I would intervene. You know, that happened in high school. It happened in college, and then in college, I was a big guy, as you know, an athlete, strong, playing some college football, and a friend of mine, a mutual athlete friend of mine from a rival high school, happened to be in the same college, you know, introduced me to a bouncing job, you know. So I ended up becoming a nightclub bouncer in the early part of college. And I did that for about 6 years before I became a police officer. And I found it, I found like it was natural to me to defend people, you know, and
Yeah,
keep the
yeah.
peace on that
So
level, you know. And there's a lot of stories in this book about my years as a bouncer, you know.
yeah, some
Um,
really good ones, some really
yeah,
entertaining ones.
I,
So, as you became this protector, you know, and finally decided that being a police officer
mhm.
was where you were going. One of the stories, there's so many good stories in this book, but one of the stories, and I don't want us to run out of time, maybe you could just tell us about 9/11, because that story just so stuck with me after reading
That's
it. So if you could briefly tell us
yeah.
about 9/11.
Two things. Just so I was post college working in the private sector. I had taken the police exams. Uh, Senior year of high school, I took a couple of police exams, and I wasn't doing well on Wall Street. So I ended up following a calling into the police department. And
Mhm.
that's how I became the ultimate protector. As far as 9/11 goes, that's a lot to talk about. I was in the
Oh,
detective bureau. I can summarize it as quickly as
okay.
I'll do my best for you. The bottom line is I was in the Queens Detective Bureau at the time, and when the buildings came down, I was on a day off, and we were all mobilized. Every member of the service, their days were canceled, and in my capacity on 9/11, I was a squad detective handling every crime from larceny to homicide, right?
Mm,
And everything in between for a precinct in Queens. So 9/11 was very difficult for every cop involved and any first responder. But for me in particular, and those who worked in my capacity, we had to deal with the aftermath of 9/11 as well as continue managing a caseload and deal with victims of crimes on a daily basis. So that was a very stressful aspect of it. But as far as the buildings coming down, it was the magnitude of that operation blows your mind, blew my mind. I was traumatized and awed by what I saw taking place. The actual recovery attempt ending, and then the removal of debris, scooping up the World Trade Center, putting it in trucks, driving it down to Battery Park, putting it on barges, taking it across the river, putting it back on a different set of trucks and driving it to the top of the Fresh Kills landfill. It just was a major
yeah.
undertaking. If you think how big the undertaking of building the World Trade Center was, uh, I would argue that cleaning it up was a close second in this capacity. And for detectives in the Detective Bureau, we worked at the landfill. Uh, it was the largest crime scene we'd ever seen, obviously. And it was managed by detectives and those sifting through the rubble and the debris, looking for remains and evidence or whatever,
Ah,
keepsakes for family members. So we were at the landfill as detectives, and then we were at the morgue, processing remains and invoicing body, human remains and human property. And there were, 12-hour shifts at the morgue and 12-hour shifts on the landfill. And the way I describe the landfill is, if the pile was hell on earth, where, in other words, the site, the landfill of the World Trade Center, the landfill was hell on Mars, because it's like being on another planet up there. You get to the bottom of the mountain, they'd load us on buses and take us to the top of the giant mountain of garbage, and there was the World Trade Center in rubble, and all of the cars and everything that was, and then everywhere around there were puddles from the previous days of rain, like just giant mud puddles, and they were bubbling like some kind of sick science project. And there was just a stench of methane in the air. It was very troubling, and very, in the early days, there was very little protective gear that was appropriate to the hazardous air that was up there. And it took them a few months to get it right, but they finally got it right. But now the tragedy is a lot of members of the service that served up there and on the pile, are dying of all these, strange strands of cancer. But that was pretty much my experience. The morgue was very morbid and dark.
No, it was really, and you wrote it so compellingly. It just really stuck with me as you talked about it, and it was something that I'd not read anyplace before.
Right.
About
Yeah.
that wasn't something that when you hear all the 9/11 stories, that one, just hasn't been told the way you told it. So that just really struck me so well. I felt as I was reading this that you have a lot of good novels left in you. Are you working on anything?
I'm glad you asked. Well, honestly, this memoir, in my estimation, is worthy of at least 2 or 3 novels, maybe 2. I'm going to be conservative and say 2, but I have an idea of a series of fictional characters, loosely based on some of the stuff in this book that I hope to do. I have a novel on the drawing board right now, and I'm looking forward to when the promotion for this book slows down. I've started already dabbling and outlining, and I'm looking forward to diving in and trying my hand at some fiction.
I think that's awesome, because that's what I thought reading it. I thought this could be a whole story. This could be a whole story. So that sounds really good. We don't want to let you go away without, I know that you are an avid reader. You read all the time. Do you have 1 or 2 recommendations that you could briefly tell us about?
Well, sure. I've been an avid reader of memoirs and biographies for decades. And the reason for that is just in my position in law enforcement, I wanted to learn the best about the leadership. So I would always read biographies about great leaders, And most recently, I've read Bill Bratton's book, The Profession. I think it's a great read, and I believe that it's a amazing history lesson on the last 60 years of law enforcement in the United States. So that's one for sure. And I'm going to go way back with this one. I also was in Barnes and Noble's a month ago, looking at some different books, and I came across a book, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass.
Oh.
And it was a new kind of book on the shelf, and it's a quick read. It can't be more than 200-300 pages, and I couldn't put it down. I'd learned about Frederick Douglass as a young man in 7th grade for the first time when I left Catholic school, and I've always been a fan and a fan. That's probably I've always been a student. What would Frederick Douglass do? And this memoir of his, spoken in his own voice, about his childhood as a slave, and he pretty much speaks about year after year after year, this plantation to that plantation, to him finally making his escape. I thought it was a fascinating read. So those are two. One that I really enjoyed from years ago, I mentioned it because I like to read memoirs. There was a judge in New York City. His name was Bruce Wright. Okay, and he was notorious, not well liked by the rank and file of the police department. Now, this is back in my father's day, before I was a police officer. He may have been still a judge when I was, but I don't recall. I never had to deal with him. But he did a memoir. It was called Black Justice in a White World. And
great title.
He was a very controversial judge in New York City. I think it was. I forget the mayor. It was not mayor. It was the mayor before Beam that put him on the court. But anyway, he had the nickname the police gave him, "Turn him loose, Bruce." Because, so it was, and I used to hear it as a kid all, hey, turn, and I hear my father, there he is again, turn him loose, Bruce, or cut him loose, Bruce, either one. And so I grew up hearing turn him loose, Bruce, or cut him loose, Bruce. And some years into my career, I came across his memoir, and I picked it up and I read it. And, it was enlightening in the sense of, you just hear the negative about someone and then you read their memoir and their account of what they went through. And it all made sense, what his politics were, or what his policies were, or how he adjudicated cases. So I recommend that one as well. So it's kind of a blast from the past, but the Profession by Bill Bratton, and another one. If you're into cop books, as far as this is another memoir, and it's kind of a flamethrower. It's by a guy named Norm Stamper. It's called Breaking Rank. Okay. And I was given that book years ago, and and it sticks in my mind. It was kind of motivation, or part motivation or inspiration for my memoir. But this guy literally, he was police chief in San Diego and in Seattle, the top of both departments, over a 25, 30-year period, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I suppose, if I recall correctly. But in writing a memoir, in dealing with publishers, after them reading it, we like your product, however, you have to be concerned about libel, was what they threw back at me. And I had to go through my book and cut about 12, 16 pages out, and then it passed muster. But this guy, Norm Stamper, I don't know how he got this book published, because he literally
he names names, does he?
Oh my goodness, does he? Yeah, and it's literally an incredible account of the good cops, but mainly the bad cops that he encountered from patrol days to being the chief of police and dealing with corrupt police chiefs and politicians, and just an incredible. It reads like a fiction, but it's
wow, yeah.
So those are a couple of
those are great. Those are great. Thank you so much. So if our audience wanted to find out more about you, they want to find your book, they want to find out more about you, what's the best place for them to look online?
Okay, well, the book is available at authorhouse.com. Okay, it's also available with Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And it's pretty much the title, From Prey to Protector by Robert Johnson. You go on Amazon or Author House or Barnes and Noble, it'll come right up. That's the cover, and it's available now. And as far as contacting me, I'll give an email address: Rob A. Johnson at robajohnson22@gmail.com. If there are any questions.
Yeah, if people have any questions, or you want to follow up with Rob, that would be great. And we'll make sure we put that in underneath the video when we post it. Yeah.
I appreciate it. In addition to that, I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well.
Under Robert Johnson.
Robert Johnson, for sure.
Facebook and Instagram, so you can find him. And I thank you.
Instagram, I am actually Papa J92. My daughter gave me that name for Instagram when she opened my account.
Papa J92. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you for being with us. And I hope I will see you next week for another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? Bye, everybody.
Thank you.